First, though, we get to the BRICS Summit in South Africa. President Xi is meeting with key allies. During his meeting with the president of Senegal, Xi says China supports including the African Union in the G20 economic bloc. He also told Ethiopia's prime minister that China's modernization would bring new opportunities and cooperations. And with Bangladesh, the prime minister there, he called for increased cooperation on the Belt and Road and as well as infrastructure and IT. President Xi also told Cuba's president that Beijing firmly supports Havana's national sovereignty and opposes the U.S. economic blockade. Now, President Xi also spoke at the BRICS Summit on Wednesday, calling on members to maintain a peaceful development and strengthen the bloc's strategic partnerships. Robert Nigala has more from Johannesburg.
Leaders from BRICS member states arrived at the Sandton Convention Center in Johannesburg on Wednesday morning for a closed plenary session. According to officials, the closed-door session focused on how to harness the full potential of the grouping. In his remarks at an open plenary session, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, the host of this year's summit, said discussions on adopting the use of local currencies between member states was ongoing.
Global economic recovery relies on predictable global payment systems and the smooth operating of banking, supply chains, trade, tourism, as well as financial flows.
Chinese President Xi Jinping outlined 4 areas the bloc should focus on to build on its achievements. They are the deepening of business and financial cooperation to boost economic growth, expanding political and security cooperation to uphold peace and tranquility, increasing people-to-people exchanges and promoting mutual learning between civilizations, and upholding fairness and justice and improving global governance.
International rules must be written and jointly upheld by all countries based on the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, rather than dictated by those with the strongest muscles or the loudest voice. Ganging up to form exclusive groups and packaging their own rules as international norms are even more unacceptable. BRICS countries should practice true multilateralism, uphold the UN-centered international system, support and strengthen the WTO multilateral trading system, and reject the attempt to create small circles or exclusive blocs.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi set out 5 areas for deepening cooperation between member states. They include outer space development, innovation, skills development, protection of wildcats, and traditional medicine. Russian President Vladimir Putin, who did not travel to the summit but attended via videolink, said the BRICS' influence on global affairs was growing, adding that its strategic course was aimed at the future. Meanwhile, Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva noted the gains the bloc had made over the years, including its inclusiveness. The tone of the summit has now been set with multilateralism at the head of the agenda. And with development cooperation amongst member states taking center stage, the expansion of the bloc and use of local currencies in trade will remain in the headlines for the duration of the summit. Robert Nagela, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Agricultural trade, a big focus at the summit. Officials from the countries discuss ways to deepen trade ties and overcome challenges. Julie Shire has more.
Increasing agricultural trade was in the spotlight at the 15th BRICS Summit in Johannesburg. Member states, India and China, are big importers of food, but little is traded amongst the 5 nations.
We are important in a big market that is roughly over $300 billion, and China and India make up roughly about 85% of that. So we think about how do you deepen trade amongst ourselves, because most of those products, they actually coming from outside the BRICS.
One of South Africa's biggest farming companies exports most of its apples, pears and avocados to the United Kingdom, Europe and other parts of Africa. It does, however, believe expansion lies beyond those borders.
CZ2's mission is to grow the export market further and is hoping the BRICS Summit will open doors into China and India.
I see the Indo-Pacific region as a very important target long-term for South African produce. We have all the resources in South Africa, but also Southern Africa. And the distance from our ports to the destinations, the harbors in the Indo-Pacific region, is shorter most of the time than it is to our traditional markets into Europe or the US.
A small percentage of South African produce goes to Brazil, Russia, India and China, although these markets hold huge potential for South Africa.
Our local markets are saturated, so there's not a lot of opportunity to grow there. If you want to enter into the business with marketable products in the local market, international trade normally gives you higher margins if you're efficient. We should be able to grow the agricultural industry with leaps and bounds.
Delegates agree that tough conditions which govern food exports need to be addressed.
The key thing when we're thinking about trade that we're putting on the table is how do you lower the import tariffs, and also how do you deal with phytosanitary barriers. So those are things that needs to happen. It's one thing to say let's deal with trade, but trade is not happening because the tariffs are higher and there are phytosanitary barriers.
South Africa exported a record $12.8 billion worth of agricultural products in 2022, around half of what it produced. The country is pinning its hopes on the BRICS nations to grow that further. Julie Shara, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Argentina expected to join the BRICS New Development Bank during the summit. Now, ahead of the meeting, the Central Bank President of Argentina, Miguel Pese, spoke to Joel Richards in Buenos Aires, and they spoke about why Argentina is hoping to join the development bank.
Nosotros tenemos muchas esperanzas de ser incorporados al grupo de los BRICS y al nuevo Banco de Desarrollo. Creo que esto tiene que ver con la colaboración sur-sur, con la colaboración entre países emergentes. Creo que es mucho más fácil comprendernos entre nosotros mismos que tratar de explicarles nuestras particularidades a los países centrales que han tenido procesos de desarrollo distintos y durante largos periodos de su historia estrategias coloniales que son reñidas con nuestros principios y nuestras visiones.
What exactly about joining the BRICS Bank is it that you believe would help Argentina, given the country's economic situation?
Lo que uno espera del nuevo Banco de Desarrollo, del Banco de los BRICS, es que justamente estando nosotros va a ser mucho más fácil comprender las realidades y poder atender las necesidades de financiamiento, especialmente en infraestructura que tienen los países emergentes. Un buen ejemplo de la capacidad de comprensión que tenemos entre nosotros mismos es que la Argentina tenía un problema financiero recientemente para poder realizar el pago que tenía que hacer al Fondo Monetario Internacional a fin de julio. Y intentamos distintos caminos para solucionar este problema. Quienes han tenido los oídos abiertos y quienes nos han ayudado ha sido la Corporación Andina de Fomento, ha sido el Banco del Pueblo de China a través del swap de monedas que tenemos con ellos y también Qatar.
You mentioned South-South cooperation. I just wonder how has that come about and how has that dynamic been? How open have other countries, nations been to helping Argentina in this moment?
Bueno, yo creo que en esto China ha tenido un rol muy especial. Desde el encuentro en Bali del presidente Xi Jinping con el presidente Fernández se amplió el uso del swap de monedas, que nos ha ayudado mucho, especialmente en este contexto donde la sequía ha golpeado mucho las exportaciones argentinas. Hemos perdido un cuarto de nuestras exportaciones debido a la sequía. Entonces yo creo que allí hay un buen ejemplo de cómo la cooperación sur-sur ayuda a los países que tienen condiciones de desarrollo similares y una mejor comprensión de la realidad.
Central Bank President of Argentina there. For more on the BRICS Summit, Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, the Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, joins us. Good to see you, Elizabeth. Thank you for helping us with this, I think, somewhat complex topic because, you know, we know the BRIC is the BRIC, then it became the BRICS, and now it's the BRICS Plus, and it may be many more. let me start by getting your reaction on China's role in President Xi's speech.
Good morning, Phil, from Johannesburg. Good to be with you. I think President Xi's speech today must also be seen in the broader context of the fact that he was also in South Africa on a state visit. And so he has been quite prominent in the media, both in terms of the series of agreements that were signed between South Africa and China yesterday, as well as in the context of the discussions around the business forum, and then obviously today. The speech today certainly resonated in many quarters in South Africa in terms of not only emphasizing the fact that I think BRICS countries take pride in following independent foreign policies and decisions around their development, but also about outlining areas of cooperation, which I think your correspondents also referred to earlier. What I think is very important from a South African perspective is the fact that there have been a number of really concrete initiatives which are very important for South Africa that China has been able to sort of assist with. And, one of the focus areas of this BRICS has been BRICS and Africa, but critically about using and leveraging the economic power of the BRICS on the one hand to create opportunities for both South African companies to export to China in particular, but also the rest of the continent. And I think that was one of the most sort of significant messages to resonate in the broader discussion in South Africa over the last couple of days. Drawing from President Xi's statements.
The BRICS group was originally created mainly for sort of economic cooperation. Although I will say in recent years, it seems to have become, there's more of a political twist to it, because I guess you can't help it. When you get enough people together, they're ultimately going to talk politics. Then there's sort of the other elephant in the room where Russia, of course, is there, but they're not there, but they are there. What do you think was said about their participation, and what is their level of participation given the controversy, what's happening in Ukraine?
So, of course, I think a lot of the discussion around the indictment, the ICC indictment of President Putin dominated the discussions in the run-up to the decision that was finally taken that President Putin would attend virtually. I think certainly from a South African and African perspective, the message has always been, since the start of the war, the message has been very clear that the way to deal with this is really to negotiate, that all wars inevitably end in some sort of diplomatic initiatives, and that South Africa and indeed many other countries on the African continent are keen to put effort into helping to bring this about. Clearly, I think President Putin in his address today sort of set out his perspective on what the issues were with regard to the Ukrainian conflict. But I think the other leaders really reiterated the importance of diplomacy and peaceful settlement of disputes, and their willingness, and particularly from an African perspective, to take this forward. I think in terms of President Putin's virtual participation, I think he spoke today. He also spoke at the business forum yesterday, and of course the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is representing him. And I think, Russia is going to be chairing the BRICS next year, and I think President Putin set out some of their objectives and their thinking in that regard. So I think they're engaging in this very directly and very actively. Given that a lot of the, what comes out of this the summit, tomorrow, are going to be issues that they will also be taking forward when they begin their chairmanship next year.
You can't help but notice there's obviously more countries interested in joining the BRICS, and then there's also this other layer of this de-dollarization, for lack of a better word, that the countries would like to come together to have an alternative, I guess, to the U.S. dollar, or essentially borrowing the U.S. dollar. Tell me how the economics of that is going to work, and who ultimately would be in charge of a potential, I guess, group currency, because you still have to have rules and regulations to make sure that there's stability there.
So I think the important point to make here is that de-dollarization or the creation of a new reserve currency doesn't, you know, it's not declared. You don't declare it, and so it happens. You know, I think it's much more of a process than it is an event. And there's been a lot of discussion over the last few months around this. And I think, just to go back to your point about the growing interest in other countries to join the BRICS, I think the geopolitical contestation and the polarization that we've seen emerge over the last couple of years, I think has really activated some of the thinking in a number of other global South countries about, you know, joining alternative formations that create opportunities for different economic systems to emerge. I think the discussion around de-dollarization or the creation of a BRICS currency is I think these are first steps in a process. Clearly, you know, there isn't going to be anything definitively announced in the next 24 hours. I think the issue about a BRICS, or at least greater trading in local currencies, at least in the short term, I think is something that is certainly very tangible and feasible, and something that has already started. I think the bigger issue is, how do you move forward in terms of creating a BRICS currency, which, as we see in the case of the European Union, is a little bit more complicated.
Well, look, obviously there's a long road ahead. There's a lot of complication, and you can't ignore the politics behind it. I think it's fascinating to see what the BRICS will become, say, 3, 4, 5 years from now. I suppose we'll know more in the coming days. Elizabeth, thank you for your analysis. Appreciate it very much.